The air over central Germany hangs heavy and still, pressed down by cold that refuses to break. Snow sits in the bomb craters like ash that never cooled. Roofless buildings cast long, crooked shadows over streets where windows are boarded with scrap wood and doors are patched with tin. In the town square, civilians stand in silence. Not in protest. Not in celebration. In waiting. Their coats are thin. Their faces narrow from months of rationing. Children clutch empty containers, metal cans polished smooth by years of use. A mother pulls a scarf tighter as a U.S. Army truck grinds to a halt nearby, its tires crunching over frozen rubble. The markings on the vehicle are unmistakable. American. The same nation whose aircraft once filled this sky. The same uniforms that marched through these streets less than 2 years earlier. A soldier drops the tailgate. Crates are unloaded by gloved hands. Inside them, powdered milk, condensed milk, food meant for infants, for the sick, for survival. No one speaks at first. Some look away. Others stare, unsure whether to step forward. Because in a town shaped by defeat, hunger, and memory, this moment raises a question few expected to face so soon. How did Germany arrive here, dependent on aid from the very power that had helped destroy it? By the time the Third Reich formally surrendered on May 8, 1945, the country's physical and administrative foundations had collapsed almost entirely. Years of strategic bombing had pulverized cities into fields of rubble. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Berlin, each stood as a landscape of broken masonry and burnt-out shells where neighborhoods had once functioned as living systems. Rail yards were twisted steel. Bridges lay in rivers. Power stations were silent or destroyed. But destruction alone did not explain the crisis that followed. War had severed Germany's ability to feed itself long before surrender. Agricultural labor had been drained by conscription. Fertilizer production collapsed as chemical plants were bombed or repurposed. Farm machinery was scarce, fuel almost non-existent. Livestock herds had been slaughtered or lost to fighting. Even regions that had escaped heavy bombing could not transport food to cities whose rail lines no longer worked. The result was immediate and measurable. In many urban areas, daily caloric intake fell below 1,000 calories per person. In some months, it dipped closer to 800. This was not temporary hunger. It was chronic malnutrition spreading through millions of civilians, women, children, the elderly, and returning prisoners of war. The winter of 1945-46 revealed the depth of the collapse. Coal shortages meant homes went unheated. Electricity was rationed or absent. People dismantled ruined buildings not to rebuild, but to bane beams for warmth. Trees vanished from city parks. Furniture became fuel. The line between survival and exhaustion narrowed each week. Milk, once a staple for children, had effectively disappeared. Dairy farms could not operate at scale. Transport was impossible. Fresh milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Infants were fed watered-down substitutes or nothing at all. Pediatric clinics reported rising cases of rickets, wasting, and disease linked directly to malnutrition. The Allied occupation inherited this reality the moment German authority dissolved. The country was divided into zones, American, British, French, and Soviet, each responsible for administration, security, and basic welfare within its borders. Yet the Allies had not arrived with a unified vision for Germany's future. Initial policy was shaped by fear. Fear of resurgence. Fear of repeating the perceived mistake of post-World War I reconstruction. Early directives emphasized demilitarization, denazification, and economic restraint. Germany, in this view, was to be prevented from rebuilding its industrial strength too quickly. But food shortages respected no ideology. By late 1945, U.S. Army civil affairs officers were reporting conditions that alarmed even hardened military administrators. Hospitals lacked supplies. Schools closed because children were too weak to attend. Black markets flourished as ration systems failed to meet basic needs. Starvation was not uniform, but it was widespread enough to threaten order. American soldiers on occupation duty encountered this reality daily. They patrolled streets lined with civilians scavenging for anything edible. They guarded warehouses knowing the population outside was hungry. Many had fought across Europe only months earlier. Now they were tasked with maintaining stability among people who had been enemies. The moral and strategic tension was unavoidable. A starving population could not be governed indefinitely. Hunger bred unrest, resentment, and desperation. It also made Germany vulnerable, politically and socially, to forces beyond Allied control. By early 1946, it became clear that Germany's crisis was not an internal problem alone. It was a European one. Refugees flowed across borders. Disease did not remain contained within zones. Economic paralysis in Germany threatened recovery across the continent. And beneath all of it was a simple, relentless fact: without external food supplies, millions of civilians, especially children, would not survive. This reality forced a re-evaluation, not of sympathy, but of necessity. The question facing American planners was no longer whether to intervene, but how far intervention would have to go, and what form it would take. That question would soon reshape occupation policy in ways few had anticipated, beginning with the most basic substance of all: milk. Inside the American occupation zone, military governors and civilian advisors were sending increasingly urgent reports back to Washington. These were not emotional appeals. They were assessments, charts tracking caloric intake, hospital admission rates, infant mortality figures, fuel reserves measured in days, not months. The conclusion repeated itself in different language: Germany could not stabilize without food imports. The United States, unlike Europe, possessed surplus. American agriculture had expanded massively during the war. Mechanized farming, intact infrastructure, and government purchasing programs had produced stockpiles that exceeded domestic demand. Warehouses were full. Silos were stocked. Milk powder and condensed milk, produced in industrial quantities, could be stored, shipped, and reconstituted with minimal equipment. This mattered. Fresh milk was impractical in post-war Germany. Powdered milk was not. Policy began to shift, not abruptly, but decisively. The U.S. Army Civil Affairs Division, responsible for administering occupied territory, adjusted its mandate. Feeding the population was no longer viewed as charity. It became an operational requirement. Hunger, left unchecked, threatened security, governance, and long-term recovery. International frameworks were already in place. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRA, had been created during the war to address post-conflict humanitarian crises. Germany, initially excluded due to its role in the conflict, became impossible to ignore. Parallel efforts emerged. The CARE program, established in late 1945 by American humanitarian organizations, organized private relief shipments. These included non-perishable foods, flour, fats, sugar, and notably, milk products. Milk occupied a particular focus because of its role in infant survival. Reports from German health offices showed alarming trends among children under 5. Many had been born during air raids, grown through displacement, and now faced malnutrition during their most vulnerable years. For American planners, infant mortality was not only a humanitarian concern, it was a warning sign of systemic failure. Logistics determined everything. Food had to enter through ports that were still damaged. It had to move across rail networks that barely functioned. American engineers repaired lines, cleared canals, and rerouted shipments where necessary. Distribution was tightly controlled to prevent hoarding or diversion. Ration cards were recalibrated. Priority categories were established: children, nursing mothers, the sick. The presence of American milk in German towns was therefore not spontaneous. It was the visible endpoint of bureaucratic decisions, shipping schedules, and policy debates that stretched from Europe to Washington. There was resistance. Some officials questioned feeding a former enemy while parts of Europe still suffered. Others feared dependency. But the counterargument prevailed: starvation would cost more, in security, in influence, and in lives, than relief ever would. By the winter of 1946-47, one of the coldest on record, the stakes sharpened further. Rivers froze, halting transport. Coal shortages deepened. Food distribution faltered across much of Europe. In Germany, already fragile, conditions approached catastrophe. Emergency measures followed. Shipments increased. Milk powder allocations were expanded. American trucks became a familiar sight in towns that still bore the scars of bombardment. The contrast was stark. Military vehicles once associated with conquest now delivered sustenance. For German civilians, the arrival of milk carried layered meaning. It was practical nourishment, yes, but it was also symbolic. Milk was for children, for the future. It implied survival beyond mere subsistence. For American authorities, it marked a quiet but profound transition. The occupation was no longer solely about control or punishment. It was about preservation, of order, of life, and of a society that could eventually stand on its own. That shift would be felt not in speeches or treaties, but in kitchens, clinics, and ration lines, where civilians encountered aid not as policy, but as something tangible, unexpected, and deeply unsettling in its implications. Those encounters, and the many perspectives surrounding them, reveal the true complexity of this moment. By 1946, starvation rarely announced itself with collapse in the streets. Instead, it hollowed people gradually. Weight dropped. Illness lingered. Children stopped growing. In apartments without heat or electricity, families structured their days around ration schedules and rumors of distribution. A missed delivery could mean days without protein. When milk appeared, powdered, condensed, unfamiliar, it carried immediate practical value. Mothers learned how to dilute it carefully, stretching portions while preserving nutrition. Clinics used it to stabilize infants who had survived the war only to falter in peace. For many children, it was the first reliable source of calories they had received in months. Yet the shock was not only nutritional. It was emotional. The aid came from Americans. The same uniforms that had once symbolized bombing raids and occupation now stood at distribution points handing out supplies intended for German children. Some civilians hesitated to accept it. Others took it silently. A few refused at first, pride clashing with necessity. Hunger resolved that conflict quickly. The milk altered daily rhythms. Mothers queued earlier. Clinics reopened wards. Teachers reported improved attendance as children regained strength. These changes were small, almost invisible, but they accumulated into something larger, a fragile sense that survival might extend beyond the next week. Angle 2. Psychological impact of aid from an enemy. For many Germans, accepting American milk required confronting defeat in a deeply personal way. This was not surrender on paper. It was dependence in the most intimate sphere, feeding one's child. Diaries from the period reveal complex reactions, gratitude mixed with resentment, relief shadowed by shame. The aid exposed vulnerability that propaganda had long denied. The psychological weight was uneven. Older civilians who had lived through earlier conflicts understood the pattern of hunger after war. Younger adults, raised under promises of self-sufficiency and strength, found the reversal harder to absorb. Children, unaware of ideology, accepted the milk without question. In doing so, they became the quiet center of the transformation. Angle 3. The occupation soldier's perspective. American soldiers assigned to civil affairs units did not view milk distribution as symbolic. It was logistical. They worked from warehouses and depots, following schedules and inventory lists. Milk powder was counted, measured, and guarded. Orders emphasized fairness and discipline. Any perception of favoritism could undermine trust. Yet the human reality intruded. Soldiers saw children thinner than expected. They listened to translators explain usage instructions to exhausted mothers. Many had families of their own back home. The distance between battlefield victory and post-war responsibility narrowed. Some soldiers struggled with a contradiction. They had lost friends fighting German forces. Now they were tasked with sustaining German civilians. Military training did not prepare them for that moral terrain. Still, the mission continued, governed by orders and necessity. Over time, routine replaced tension. Distribution points became predictable. Civilians learned procedures. Soldiers learned faces. The transaction, milk for ration cards, settled into the fabric of occupation life. But beyond routine, the presence of milk hinted at something broader. It suggested a future beyond control and punishment. It implied reconstruction rather than stagnation. That implication would not remain confined to streets and clinics. It extended into policy, ideology, and international strategy, areas where the meaning of American aid would be debated with far greater consequence. Washington's attention had begun to shift eastward. Relations with the Soviet Union were deteriorating rapidly. Across Europe, political instability fed extremist movements, particularly in regions where hunger and unemployment were most severe. Germany, geographically central, economically vital, psychologically wounded, stood at the crossroads of this emerging divide. Food, including milk, became a stabilizing instrument. Well-fed populations were less volatile. Children who survived infancy could grow into a workforce capable of supporting recovery. Relief, in this sense, was preventative policy. American officials understood that aid carried visibility. Every crate marked with English text, every American uniform at a distribution point, communicated intent. It contrasted sharply with conditions in zones where supplies were scarcer and governance more rigid. Without speeches or declarations, relief deliveries began shaping perception. Milk, because it was directed at children, carried particular resonance. It signaled that American policy extended beyond short-term control. It suggested investment in Germany's future rather than exploitation of its defeat. Angle 5. Moral reckoning after total war. World War II had erased illusions about clean victory. The scale of destruction forced Allied leaders to confront uncomfortable truths. Starving civilians in Germany were not soldiers. They were not decision-makers. Many were victims of a regime they could not escape. Punishing them further risked repeating the mistakes that had followed the First World War, mistakes widely believed to have fueled extremism. Feeding former enemies raised moral objections, but it also offered moral clarity. Milk was not a weapon. It did not restore factories or rearm divisions. It kept children alive. This distinction mattered. Relief allowed Allied forces to draw a line between justice and vengeance. Denazification could proceed without collective starvation. Accountability could exist without annihilation. For many Americans involved in planning and execution, this was not framed as forgiveness. It was framed as responsibility. Victory carried obligations as well as authority. Angle 6. International observation and European recovery. Germany's recovery was closely watched. Neighboring countries, themselves devastated, measured Allied actions carefully. The treatment of Germany would set precedent. If the defeated nation were allowed to collapse entirely, Europe's economic network would fracture further. Coal, steel, trade, and transport all depended on German participation. Milk shipments were small in tonnage compared to industrial aid, but large in symbolism. They indicated a broader shift toward rehabilitation. Other nations took note. Relief agencies adjusted priorities. Conversations about coordinated recovery intensified. Within 2 years, this momentum would crystallize into formal policy, but its roots were visible earlier, in ration lines, clinics, and the quiet normalization of survival. By stabilizing daily life, aid created space for political decisions that would otherwise have been impossible. Elections, administrative reform, and economic planning required population not consumed by hunger. As winter loosened its grip and deliveries continued, the cumulative effect became undeniable. Mortality rates among children stabilized. Public unrest diminished. The crisis did not vanish, but it receded from catastrophe to challenge. That shift marked a turning point, not dramatic, not announced, but real. It emerged from logistics and policy, from discipline and restraint. And as 1947 progressed, the consequences of that turning point would become impossible to ignore, pushing relief efforts from necessity into doctrine. Across Central Europe, temperatures plunged well below seasonal norms. Rivers froze solid. Snow blocked rail lines already weakened by years of neglect. Barges carrying coal and food were immobilized. In Germany, where reserves were minimal and infrastructure fragile, the cold magnified every existing weakness. By January 1947, food distribution in many towns verged on collapse. Rations fell again. In some areas, daily caloric intake dropped to emergency levels. Hospitals reported surges in respiratory illness and malnutrition-related complications. Infants and the elderly were most vulnerable. For American occupation authorities, the crisis forced immediate decisions. Waiting was no longer an option. Emergency allocations were approved. Milk powder shipments were increased despite strained transport capacity. Priority lists were revised to ensure that infants, pregnant women, and medical facilities received supplies first. Military trucks were reassigned from non-essential duties to food transport. Engineers worked through sub-zero conditions to clear tracks and roads. This was the moment when relief ceased to be supplemental and became decisive. In towns across the American zone, milk distribution expanded beyond clinics. Temporary feeding centers were established. Schools reopened specifically to serve meals. Pediatric wards received standardized nutrition supplies. The presence of American milk became routine, not because the crisis had eased, but because the response had intensified. The effects were measurable. By late February, medical officers reported stabilization in infant mortality rates in several districts. Weight gain, modest but consistent, appeared in clinical records. These were not victories announced in headlines. They were lines on charts. But they mattered. The psychological impact deepened as well. Civilians began to plan days, weeks, even months ahead, something that had been impossible during the immediate post-war years. The certainty of milk rations allowed families to structure care for their children. Clinics could anticipate needs instead of reacting to emergencies. For American policymakers, these outcomes confirmed assumptions that had been debated for months. Relief was not weakening control. It was strengthening it. Stability followed nourishment. Yet the winter was not over. Coal shortages persisted. Housing remained inadequate. Black markets continued to siphon supplies. The risk of unrest lingered. What changed was trajectory. By March 1947, the question was no longer whether Germany could survive the winter. It was whether survival could be transformed into recovery. That question reached Washington at a critical moment. The United States was reassessing its global role. Europe's instability threatened to undermine the post-war order entirely. The experience of feeding Germany, of preventing collapse through targeted aid, provided a template. Milk, once an emergency measure, now stood as evidence. Evidence that intervention worked. That former enemies could be stabilized rather than suppressed. That recovery was possible even amid ruin. As temperatures slowly rose and transport lines reopened, American officials prepared to formalize what had begun under pressure. The turning point was no longer confined to Germany. It was becoming policy. And in that transition, from emergency relief to strategic commitment, the full significance of those winter deliveries would finally be realized. In the American occupation zone, conditions remained severe, but they were no longer spiraling. Transport corridors reopened as ice retreated from rivers and canals. Rail traffic, though limited, resumed predictable schedules. Warehouses that had stood nearly empty months earlier now operated under managed flow. This shift allowed planners to step back and evaluate outcomes. The data told a consistent story. Areas that had received sustained food relief, particularly milk supplements for children, showed measurable improvements in public health. Infant mortality stabilized. Hospital admissions linked to severe malnutrition declined. School attendance increased as children regained strength. These were not abstract indicators. They translated directly into administrative control. Local German officials, operating under Allied supervision, could function again. Public order improved. The daily struggle for survival loosened its grip just enough to permit governance. In Washington, these developments coincided with a broader reckoning. Secretary of State George C. Marshall, addressing an audience at Harvard University in June 1947, articulated what many planners had already concluded privately. Europe's recovery was essential to global stability. The devastation, he argued, threatened not only individual nations but the entire international system. The experience in Germany informed this perspective. Relief had demonstrated that rebuilding was not only possible, it was necessary. Hunger did not produce compliance. It produced chaos. Stability required nourishment. Milk, in this context, symbolized a larger principle. It represented targeted, humane intervention aimed at the most vulnerable. It showed that aid could be structured, monitored, and effective without empowering extremism. As plans coalesced, the scale expanded. What began as occupation policy evolved into continental strategy. The logic that had justified feeding German children now justified feeding Europe. Within Germany, the implications were immediate. Aid programs were no longer framed as temporary concessions. They became components of a longer recovery trajectory. Agricultural support followed food imports. Seed distribution, livestock restoration, and fertilizer supply were introduced alongside continued nutritional relief. American military authorities adjusted their posture. The occupation shifted gradually from enforcement to administration. German institutions, under supervision, resumed limited autonomy. Trust, fragile but growing, began to replace fear. For civilians, the transformation remained grounded in daily experience. Milk continued to arrive. Clinics continued to operate. The emergency of winter gave way to the discipline of rebuilding. Survival became expectation rather than uncertainty. Yet the memory of dependency lingered. For many Germans, The realization that recovery had been enabled by a former enemy left a lasting imprint. It challenged narratives of victimhood and defiance alike. It reframed defeat not as annihilation, but as an opening, uncomfortable, humbling, and real. By late 1947, Germany stood at the threshold of a new phase. The immediate post-war collapse had been arrested. The path ahead remained steep, but it existed. And at the center of that shift was a lesson learned under extreme pressure, that the end of fighting did not end responsibility. The war had destroyed Germany. What followed would determine what replaced it. Those decisions and their consequences would unfold in the months and years ahead, shaping not only German society but the balance of the post-war world. The impact becomes clearest in what followed. Germany remained scarred. Cities were still piles of rubble. Housing shortages persisted. Food was rationed, and diets were monotonous. But the constant threat of mass starvation had receded, replaced by a fragile stability that allowed daily life to resume in altered form. In towns where American milk deliveries had become routine, the effects were visible first among children. Clinics reported steady improvements in weight and resistance to illness. Teachers noted increased attendance and concentration. Pediatric wards, once overwhelmed, began to empty. These changes did not signal prosperity, but they marked survival, and survival created momentum. Local administrations, operating under Allied oversight, regained functionality. Ration systems improved as transport networks stabilized. Black market activity, while still present, diminished as legal supplies became more reliable. Public order, strained in the immediate post-war years, improved as desperation eased. For American occupation authorities, this period validated the shift in policy. Feeding civilians had not undermined control. It had reinforced it. Stability reduced the need for force. Cooperation replaced resistance in many areas. The population, no longer consumed entirely by hunger, engaged with reconstruction directives more pragmatically. Milk remained a central component of relief, particularly for vulnerable groups. It was distributed through schools, clinics, and welfare centers. Instruction manuals were printed in German explaining proper preparation and nutritional value. These details mattered. They transformed aid from emergency handout into public health policy. The presence of American relief also altered interpersonal dynamics. Soldiers were no longer seen solely as occupiers. They became administrators, facilitators, and, in limited contexts, providers. This shift did not erase resentment or memory, but it complicated them. For German civilians, the aftermath was defined by adjustment. Pride yielded slowly to practicality. Dependence was acknowledged without celebration. The memory of hunger remained sharp enough to prevent complacency. Importantly, recovery was uneven. Rural areas often fared better than cities. Zones under different Allied control experienced varying levels of relief. But in the American zone, the trajectory was clay. Conditions, though harsh, were improving. These local effects fed into broader change. Germany's stabilization contributed to Europe's wider recovery. Trade resumed. Industrial planning restarted cautiously. Coal output increased. The feedback loop between nourishment and productivity began to function again. The milk that had arrived in crates during winter emergencies now flowed through institutional channels. It became part of a system rather than a surprise. In that normalization lay its greatest impact. Aid ceased to shock and began to sustain. Yet this stabilization carried long-term consequences that extended beyond immediate survival. It influenced political alignment, economic planning, and international relationships in ways that would define the post-war era. To understand those consequences, it is necessary to look beyond the first signs of recovery and examine what this period set in motion. The experience of survival under Allied assistance reshaped how many Germans understood the post-war world. The memory of receiving milk from American hands did not erase destruction or loss, but it complicated narratives that had defined the war's end. Defeat was no longer experienced only as punishment. It became associated, however uneasily, with restraint and responsibility exercised by the victor. This shift mattered politically. By 1948, the lines dividing Europe had hardened. The contrast between zones of occupation became increasingly visible. In the Western zones, sustained aid, economic planning, and administrative reform accelerated recovery. In the East, conditions followed a different trajectory. Food shortages persisted longer. Reconstruction took a more rigid form. Civilians compared experiences, quietly and constantly. The memory of American relief, especially aid directed at children, contributed to this divergence. It fostered a perception of partnership rather than domination. That perception would later support integration into Western economic and political structures. Milk shipments alone did not rebuild Germany, but they formed part of a chain of decisions that culminated in broader initiatives. The Marshall Plan, formally launched in 1948, institutionalized what emergency relief had demonstrated, that European recovery required sustained American commitment. Within Germany, the foundations laid by early relief made later reconstruction possible. Healthier children became students, apprentices, and workers. Public trust, though cautious, allowed institutions to take root. The idea of cooperation with former enemies, once unthinkable, became pragmatic. For the United States, the aftermath reinforced a lesson learned at high cost in earlier decades. Starving defeated nations did not ensure peace. Stabilizing them offered a chance at durable order. Relief became not only a humanitarian act, but a strategic principle. The long-term relationship between Germany and the United States would be shaped by this period. Military alliance, economic integration, and political cooperation all trace part of their origin to the immediate post-war years, when survival came before ideology. The image of milk in war-torn towns endured precisely because it was ordinary. It was not a treaty signing or speech. It was sustenance delivered quietly, repeatedly, without spectacle. In retrospect, that ordinariness was its power. It marked the moment when the end of war transitioned into the beginning of peace, not in declaration, but in practice. And that transition invites reflection on what victory demands, not only in force, but in restraint. War ends with surrender, but survival begins with provision. In 1947, milk was more than food. It was a lifeline, a measure of humanity, and an assertion of responsibility. It bridged the chasm between conqueror and conquered, showing that power without compassion is fragile, and that strength can be exercised not only through force, but through care. For German civilians, these deliveries were paradoxical. The hands that had once represented destruction now offered sustenance. Accepting it required humility. Administering it demanded precision. And witnessing it, watching children regain weight, seeing lines of families form in anticipation rather than desperation, invited reflection on what it meant to rebuild a society in ruins. For the United States, the lessons extended beyond humanitarianism. Relief became a tool of stability, a principle that would guide future engagement in war-torn regions. Feeding the innocent first, sustaining the vulnerable, and restoring order quietly. These were policies born in the rubble of cities and the uncertainty of harsh winters. They would inform Marshall Plan decisions, post-war diplomacy, and the emerging American role as guarantor of European recovery. And for history itself, the moment carries a reminder. The aftermath of conflict is measured not only in treaties or borders, but in daily acts that preserve life and foster trust. Milk in winter, delivered by foreign hands, saved more than bodies. It preserved potential. It allowed hope to take root in a land that had known only destruction. Victory does not end with guns. It continues in kitchens, clinics, and classrooms. It exists in the careful rationing of powdered milk and the attention to the weak, the sick, and the small. It is measured not in humiliation inflicted, but in lives restored. In the quiet towns of post-war Germany, in the eyes of children who drank that milk, and in the hands that delivered it, history offers a lesson. True power is exercised when survival becomes shared, when care replaces vengeance, and when the most ordinary acts, feeding a child, become extraordinary demonstrations of humanity.